What scares me about this bill is that a lot of the details are going to be hashed out by bureaucrats that we won't even have any power over as Canadians.
From both ministers, it may run a little bit over an hour, who knows, but we'll do it at that point, and then we can adjourn, and the following day we can pick up clause by clause on Wednesday with 11.1.
Mislead people for some other purpose. I'll finish by saying this. Legislation, of course, is complex, and broadcasting policy and its regulation can be very technical. Devils do lurk in details, and that's why the scrutiny of this committee is so important. But what's at stake here isn't hard to understand. We need to make provision for the reality of these immense and hugely powerful online platforms. We need to ensure that they give, not just take, from Canadian creators and Canadian audiences. And we need to update a broadcasting framework that was last amended before the world was even online. We need what is set out in Bill C-10 with all its provisions and all its protections. And we urge the government to pass this legislation as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Dr. Geist, 5 minutes. Please.
Before he pulls the comments down offline, the Globe and Mail called the minister's performance amateur hour on C-10. Open Media has said the Prime Minister and this minister have lost the plot with this law. Michael Geist, the leading expert, said Bill C-10 represents an unconscionable attack on free expression.
You know, my name is Michael Geist. I appear in a personal capacity representing only my own views. I always start with that statement, but it feels particularly necessary in this instance, given the misinformation and conspiracy theories that some have floated and that Minister Guilbeault disappointingly retweeted. As I'm sure you're aware, I've been quite critical of Bill C-10. I'd like to reiterate that criticism of the bill is not criticism of public support for culture, nor of regulation of technology companies. I think public support for culture is needed, and I think that there are ways to ensure money for creator programs this year, not in 5 years like in this bill. Further, I'm puzzled and discouraged by the lack of interest in Bill C-11, which would move towards modernizing Canada's privacy rules to help address concerns about how these companies collect and use our data. The bill would also mandate algorithmic transparency, which is much needed and far different from government-mandated algorithmic outcomes. I'll confine my opening remarks to the charter-related questions and widespread concern about the regulation of user-generated content, but would welcome questions on any aspect of the bill. There is simply no debating that by removing Section 4.1, the bill now applies to user-generated content, since all audiovisual content is treated as a program under the Act. You've heard experts say that, and department officials say that. The attempts to deflect from that simple reality by pointing to Section 2.1 to argue that users are not regulated is deceptive and does not speak to the issue of regulating the content of users. I'll speak to freedom of expression implications in a moment, but want to pause to note that no one, literally no other country, uses broadcast regulation to regulate user-generated content in this way. There's good reasons that all other countries reject this approach. It's not that they don't love their creators or that they want to avoid regulating internet companies. It's that regulating user-generated content in this manner is entirely unworkable, a risk to net neutrality, and a threat to freedom of expression. For example, the European Union, which isn't shy about regulation, distinguishes between streaming services such as Netflix and video sharing services such as TikTok or YouTube, with no equivalent regulations such as those found in C-10 for user-generated content. From a charter perspective, the statement issued by Justice last week simply does not contain analysis or discussion about how the regulation of user-generated content as a program intersects with the charter. There is similarly no discussion about whether this might constitute a violation that could be justified, no discussion on the implications of deprioritizing speech, no discussion on the use of terms such as social media service that aren't even defined in the bill, and no discussion of the implementation issues that could require Canadians to disclose personal location-based information in order to comply with new ill-defined requirements. In my view, the prioritization or deprioritization of speech by the government through the CRTC necessarily implicates freedom of expression. The charter statement should have acknowledged this reality and grappled with the question of whether it is saved by Section 1. I don't believe it is. First, the bill is drafted with Section 4.1. In it was the attempt to minimally impair those speech rights. With it removed, the bill no longer does so. Second, the discoverability policy objective is not enough to save the impairment of free speech rights. There is no evidence that there is a discoverability problem with user-generated content. Ms. Yale's panel, which notably appears to have lost its unanimity, recommended discoverability but cited no relevant evidence to support claims there is an issue with user-generated content. Third, the objective of making YouTube pay some additional amount to support music creation isn't enough to save the impairment of free speech rights either. It isn't about compensation because the work's already licensed. This is about paying some additional fees given concerns that Section 4.1 would have broadly exempted YouTube. I'm not convinced that was the case, as services such as YouTube Music Premium might well have been captured. And I'm not alone on that. Canadian heritage officials thought so too in a memo they wrote to the minister. In fact, it was such a non-issue that Mr. Cash's organization did not even specifically cite the provision or raise the issue in the brief it submitted to this committee. I find it remarkable that the minister and the charter statement effectively tell Canadians they should trust the CRTC to appropriately address free speech rights, but are unwilling to do so with respect to how Section 4.1 would be interpreted. Let me conclude by noting that if a choice must be made, some additional payments by a streaming service or regulating the free speech rights of Canadians, I would have thought that standing behind freedom of expression would be an easy choice to make, and I've been genuinely shaken to find that my government thinks otherwise. I look forward to your questions.
Bring it all on You're of the opposition.
The Prime Minister
Investigate allegations. It is
awesome. Thank you so much, Chair. My question is for Dr. Geist, and it is this. Both Ms. Yale and the minister, and actually all the other witnesses on this panel, I guess, today, have tried to make the claim that our freedom of speech is not being attacked by this bill. In fact, that it's not even impacted. That somehow content can be moved up or down in the queue without impacting other content. Now, it would be my opinion or my observation that in order for some information to be bumped up and made more discoverable, other information then must be bumped down. I just don't see how it's possible to not have that be the case. So when that is the case, then it means that there's a mechanism being used in order to regulate and curate what I can and cannot see, which then would be a form of censorship. Mr. Geist, I'm wondering if you can comment or elaborate on this further.
Well, I think you've highlighted what is the nub for so many experts that have spoken out on this issue. And that is that, first off, let's be clear, user-generated content, when we are speaking of the content, is regulated. I mean, it's absurd to simply suggest, well, you're exempted or the CRTC is bound by some other policy objectives. We are putting it into the basket of regulation. And we would never dream of saying the CRTC would or should regulate things like our own letters or our blog posts, but this is core expression for millions of Canadians, and we are saying that it is treated as a program like any other subject to regulation. That's number one. When you layer in on top of that, as the Liberal proposed amendment does, discoverability requirements, what you are saying is that the government, through its regulator, gets to determine what gets prioritized, not on a specific piece of content per se, but it's going to make choices, elevating some, deprioritizing others. That clearly has an impact on individual Canadians' expressive rights. It's doing so in an environment that, frankly, is completely unworkable when you think about this from a user-generated content perspective. And the notion that somehow this increases choice at a time when there is unlimited choice for user-generated content is, frankly, just absurd.
Thank you. I'll give the rest of my time to Kevin Waugh.
Well, thank you. I'm going to continue with Dr. Geist if I can, because I was at the original news conference of the Yale report, and the chair talked about leveling the playing field. And we've often heard for the last several months, level the playing field. You say that's not the case. Maybe just talk about that, because level the playing field is an expression that this government has used since they introduced this bill in November.
They do. And Ms. Yale often talks about like for like, as if we need to treat all these players in the same fashion. What we ought to recognize is that the existing broadcast sector enjoys a whole series of regulatory advantages worth hundreds of millions of dollars that are not available to streaming services. It's things like simultaneous substitution, where they
La diffusion simultanée quand on substitue.
or worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It's the must carry rule, so that you have to carry certain channels, which is otherwise unavailable. It's foreign investment restrictions or foreign ownership restrictions that are there. There are a whole series of measures that actually don't make this like for like. Now, listen, that's not to suggest that there ought not to be a regulatory environment for online undertakings. What I would say, though, is that trying to treat them in the same fashion as this bill does has rendered it fundamentally flawed. And this committee ought to know it better than anyone, because they've had witness after witness say they're concerned about things like changing Canadian ownership requirements, changing the performers, prioritization, changing Canadian intellectual property. And all of that is a function of trying to treat online in precisely the same fashion as conventional broadcasters.
You have been pretty vocal on Twitter and other social media about this. You've said, scrap this bill, start over. Others on this committee want this bill to proceed. It's been 30 plus years now since we've updated the Broadcasting Act. We all realize this act has to be modified at some point. Maybe just talk about scrapping it and what would put in there instead of what we have in front of us today.
Sure. So I would start by noting that, I think we've seen the flaws. I mean, Mr. Cash even acknowledged that it's a flawed piece of legislation. And we now have the government contradicting its own department officials again and again on things that were directly included in government memos from the Heritage Department to the minister with advice on some of these issues. And so it's a flawed piece of legislation. The concerns are real and legitimate, raised by an incredible number of people, including people who have been some of the biggest critics of tech companies in the country. And so I would suggest that I think we need to get this right, because we don't change our legislation that frequently. Clearly, it runs sometimes for decades. But at the same time, we need to ensure that there is money for creators for precisely the kinds of reasons that Mr. Cash identified. And so what I would say is the starting point is tax dollars. The government's already announced that it wants to increase the taxes on tech companies. It should take some of that tax money, allocate it directly to the various creator programs. And in doing so, there could be money this year at the time when there really is that need for money, as opposed to the way this will play out with this bill, which is undoubtedly going to take years before the CRTC and in litigation that is inevitable to ensue, so that nobody is going to see a dime coming out of this legislation for years. There's a mechanism both to get the legislation right and to ensure that creators get money, and to do so quickly.
Okay, I must have a few seconds left, and there is an open letter I see to the Prime Minister. Mr. Chair, do I still have 30 seconds left, or am I done?
I'll let you ask your question very quickly.
Okay, there is an open letter, Canadian Internet Policy and Technical Professionals, that put it out, Future of Free and Open Internet. Just comment on that, because it's a letter sent to the Prime Minister today.
It is, and I'm proud to have signed that letter. I think one of the most shameful aspects of this debate over the last few weeks has been the continual attempt to suggest that somehow it's just people who are speaking on behalf of tech companies, or are critical or don't want to see any internet regulation, who are concerned with Bill C-10. That letter has been signed by some of the fiercest critics and biggest experts around tech policy: Ron Deberts, Bianca Wileys, Nazma Ahmed, Lex Gill, people who the Canadians have learned to trust, who have expressed real concerns about the tech companies. They've looked at Bill C-10, they've looked at government policy around the internet, and said they're very concerned about the path we're headed in.
Thank you, Dr. Geist. Appreciate that. Now, folks, one thing I want to point out, and that is, in a normal setting when we're all together, sometimes our witnesses would like to be recognized for something to say. I noticed Ms. Yale has her hand up virtually, and she wishes to discuss that. However, I have to say that when we give our colleagues, when we give the member of the committee the full 6 minutes, it is theirs alone. I only ask that colleagues be cognizant of someone may have their hand up or not. You don't have to go to that person, but just know that they will be recognized. Once that colleague stops asking questions, we're going to lower the hands, and then we'll start again. So that being said, we now go to Ms. DeBruzen for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And in fact, I had noticed that Janet Yale had her hand up and seemed to want to respond to some of the pieces, some of the aspects that were touched upon by Dr. Geist on discoverability and the like. So perhaps if we could start there with your ability to respond.
Thank you very much. I want to make just 2 or 3 quick points. The first is that programs aren't regulated, undertakings are. So when Dr. Geist says if it's a program, it's regulated, it's not a program unless it's offered by an undertaking. Online undertakings are the only ones that are subject to regulation, not people who make programs.
Well, I have a feeling that they're pushing this bill first. So the internet giants actually get on board because the next one is going to be hitting them where it really counts, taxes. And the bottom line is what businesses are there for.
Discoverability as part of that algorithm, and how these things affect net neutrality and the law on net neutrality.
Right, I appreciate the question. First off, for those that aren't aware, net neutrality speaks to the need to treat all content in an equal fashion, regardless of source or destination. And so that's been a core principle, I thought, of successive governments, although it seemed like the Heritage Minister expressed some doubt in at least one media interview around that issue. Quite frankly, we just heard from Professor Trudel. He said that algorithms determine the type of content that is visible. That speaks exactly to the concerns around net neutrality. The notion that an algorithm can, in fact, undermine those net neutrality principles. Now, if it is being done at the behest of a government, which is precisely what is being proposed under this bill, it will be the CRTC that will be making those determinations. That's where the speech implications and the concerns from a net neutrality perspective arise. And that is, again, I repeat, precisely why there is no country in the world that does this. Nobody thinks it is appropriate to have a government make these kinds of choices about what gets prioritized or not prioritized with respect to content. Algorithmic transparency that Professor Trudel mentioned is something entirely separate, and in fact is something that is absolutely necessary from a regulatory perspective, and is even included in Bill C-11 that the government, for whatever reason, has largely buried and hasn't moved forward. So it's not about whether we regulate algorithms, it's about whether the CRTC and the government uses those algorithms to determine or prioritize or deprioritize what we can see.
Thank you, Dr. Geist. Now move on to our second round, everybody. Monsieur Reyes.
Mr. Reyes, for 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to ask quite a direct question to Mr. Trudel. I would like a short answer. You have often said that the CRTC is a good regulator and would not violate freedom of expression. But this morning, you had a publication in Le Devoir. So, Timothy Denton, who was part of the CRTC before, other CRTC members, Peter Menzies, among others, Philip Palmer, these are all experts who have a completely different opinion from your opinion on the current Bill C-10. Is it possible for other experts to have opinions contrary to your own that are still good arguments? Don't they have credibility too? Look, I'm not going to speak about people's credibility. However, what I have noticed is that the CRTC is under the control of legislation, and their decisions have been confirmed by tribunals. Some people who say the CRTC is a censorship office can look at the decision regarding a 2004 Quebec radio station where the court decided that the CRTC had properly enforced the rules and had not violated freedom of expression. Mr. Trudel, I just wanted to point out that you often corroborate your arguments using the CRTC, but there are people who used to work at the CRTC who are saying, whoa, this bill doesn't work. And I'm just going to quickly finish my comment. I only have 5 minutes and I will ask you another question. But I just want to point out that everyone has a right to express their opinion on this matter. I'd like to ask Mr. Geist now to explain what is the difference between 2.1 and 4.1, because the minister keeps telling us that there's 2.1, everything is protected, user-generated content will not be threatened. And at the same time, Mr. Trudel has talked about a source of confusion regarding 4.1. Could you give us your vision as a professor of law and a fervent defender of freedom of expression?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, I find it quite remarkable. We get some witnesses saying it doesn't mean anything at all. We get others saying that it should be removed. So presumably there was a problem with it. Here's the bottom line reality. As I see it, as many other experts see it, and as the department saw it, including in comments directly to this committee and in memos written to the Heritage Minister now available under the Access to Information Act. Number one, 2.1 speaks, as we've heard, directly to regulating online undertakings. And it is true that we are not going to treat 1 million TikTok users as equivalent to CTV or other broadcasters so that they don't have to appear before the CRTC, which makes a whole lot of sense. They are not broadcasters. There's been some concern even around that because, of course, we had the Heritage Minister talk about the number of viewers or followers that you have that might pull you into that scope. And we've had some creator groups that have suggested that that ought to be the standard that is used, but it doesn't appear to me that that's what 2.1 would do. What 4.1 sought to do was ensure that the programs themselves, the content, would not be treated as something subject potentially to regulation by the CRTC. There was not significant confusion. There was, to be sure, any number of different online services that would have to go before the CRTC to determine whether or not the content on their service was captured by this. That would include some of the YouTube services, but it is certainly was within the realm of possibility that those would be captured. If we are such big fans of the CRTC to get it right, I would have thought that we would have confidence that we could both safeguard and protect user-generated content and that critical form of expression, and have that confidence in the CRTC to get it right in terms of determining where the application of the law might lie.
Merci, Mr. Geist.
Thank you, Mr. Geist. One last very quick question. Is it possible to be for net neutrality? As Mr. Guilbeault said, as Ms. Joly said, as Mr. Lametti said many times, and agree with the amended bill as it is currently. Can someone be for both at the same time?
I don't believe that the bill as currently drafted, much less some of the plans that we know the government has talked about with respect to website blocking, are consistent with net neutrality. And we should be clear, Canada has been looked to as a leader in this space, as a leading voice on net neutrality. It even has sometimes sought to distinguish itself from the United States and others where they've taken a step back from net neutrality to pass this legislation to give the government the right to prioritize or deprioritize speech severely undermines essentially our credibility as a voice for net neutrality.